Before the idea of Canada as a nation ever existed, it was the battleground for one of the greatest imperial rivalries in history. Picture it. The 17th and 18th centuries, as wooden ships from France cut across the Atlantic, bringing not just fur traders and missionaries, but thousands of soldiers, settlers, and dreams of empire. But why? Why would France, a European powerhouse, pour vast resources, manpower, and political capital into defending a stretch of land thousands of kilometers away, covered in forests, rivers, and brutal winters? The answer lies in a story of ambition, economics, identity, and legacy. New France, as it was known, was more than just a colonial outpost. It was a strategic prize in the global game of empire, a foothold in North America that offered access to immense natural wealth, from fur to fisheries to fertile farmland. The fur trade, especially beaver pelts, was the economic engine driving colonization. In Europe, beaver hats were the height of fashion, and demand was skyrocketing. Canada, with its dense forests and alliances with Indigenous trappers, became the crown jewel of France's colonial ambitions. But this wasn't just about money. It was also about rivalry with Britain. The French presence in North America was a challenge to British dominance, and both empires knew that whoever controlled the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and the rich interior trade routes would control the future of the continent. Culturally, New France was a unique experiment, a blend of French Catholic traditions and Indigenous influence. Jesuit missionaries spread religion, while settlers built seigneuries along the St. Lawrence. Indigenous alliances, particularly with the Huron-Wendat, were essential not just for trade, but for survival and military strength. This colonial culture created a deep, lasting French identity in Canada, one that endured long after France lost its grip on the territory. This video will take you deep into the story of why France fought so hard to keep Canada, through brutal winters, global wars, and colonial uprisings. You'll discover how geography, economy, and ideology collided in the forests of North America and shaped the destiny of millions. And you'll see how the legacy of French rule still echoes in modern Canada, from language and law to cultural pride and political tension. So get ready to uncover the untold reasons why Canada mattered to France, and why, even after losing it, France's presence has never truly disappeared. Coming up, the rise of New France, its fragile alliances, the battles that shaped its fate, and how its legacy lives on in Quebec and beyond. In the 1600s and 1700s, France was not just a European kingdom, it was an empire on the rise. Across the globe, France sought to expand its influence, wealth, and prestige by establishing colonies that would rival those of its fiercest competitors, Britain and Spain. This was the age of empire, when European powers were locked in a high-stakes race for global dominance, fueled by exploration, trade, military conquest, and missionary zeal. For France, overseas expansion was about far more than just planting flags on new land. It was about securing economic power through trade, accessing untapped natural resources, and spreading French culture and Catholic faith to the so-called New World. Colonies were seen as essential pieces of a global puzzle, ports and outposts that connected Europe to the Americas, Africa, and Asia. And each one strengthened France's hand on the geopolitical chessboard. In this imperial vision, Canada was not an isolated colony. It was a cornerstone of a much larger project known as New France, which stretched from the Gulf of St. Lawrence down the Mississippi River, all the way to Louisiana. This vast territory was intended to serve as both a commercial empire, rich in fur, fish, and timber, and a cultural one, where French language, law, and religion could take root on a new continent. But claiming this land was one thing, holding it was another. France's ambitions constantly clashed with those of Britain, which had established its own colonies along the eastern seaboard. And unlike the Spanish focus on gold and large indigenous empires in South America, France's efforts in North America relied on building deep alliances with indigenous nations and navigating a sprawling, often hostile wilderness. To Parisian officials, New France was both a strategic military frontier and an economic opportunity. Its rivers provided access to the continent's interior, while its position blocked British expansion westward. But to defend it, France would need more than maps and monarchs. It would need people willing to endure the cold, forge relationships with indigenous nations, and hold the line in a brewing imperial conflict. In short, Canada was not just about furs and forests, it was about global power. And in the coming decades, this icy frontier would become the flashpoint for one of the greatest imperial showdowns in history. To truly understand why France was willing to fight so fiercely for Canada, you have to look at the map. Geography made Canada strategically priceless in the battle for North America. This wasn't just rugged wilderness, it was the key to the entire interior of the continent. At the heart of New France was the St. Lawrence River, a vital artery, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean deep into the heart of the continent. Whoever controlled this waterway controlled access to the interior lands, the fur trade, and communication between settlements. The St. Lawrence was essentially the lifeline of New France, allowing for the movement of people, supplies, and troops between Quebec, Montreal, and the wider empire. Connected to the St. Lawrence were the Great Lakes, a massive freshwater highway system stretching thousands of kilometers inland. These lakes linked French forts, trading posts, and indigenous territories across present-day Ontario, Michigan, and beyond. From there, explorers and voyageurs could travel even further, through a web of rivers and portages, to reach the Mississippi River basin. This was France's grand strategy, to build a network of forts, alliances, and settlements that extended from Quebec to Louisiana, effectively controlling the entire central spine of North America. This gave France an edge in both trade and military positioning. The fur trade, especially beaver pelts, depended on deep access to the interior. And from a military standpoint, forts like Fort Frontenac, Fort Detroit, and Fort Louisbourg weren't just outposts. They were choke points, critical for defending territory and blocking British expansion. Meanwhile, British colonies were largely pinned to the Atlantic coast, hemmed in by the Appalachian Mountains. France's inland reach threatened to cut off their access to the west, trapping them between the sea and French territory. This created constant tension, as both empires vied for indigenous alliances, trading routes, and control of strategic corridors. When we say Canada was the gateway to a continent, we're talking about more than just poetic language. We're describing how geography, trade, and military power were all concentrated in this one strategic region. In the 1600s and 1700s, Europe's great empires weren't fighting over borders drawn on a map. They were battling for access and control over the lifelines of North America, and Canada was the lock that held the key. At the center of this was the St. Lawrence River, which functioned like the main road into the continent. It connected the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes, and from there, to a spiderweb of rivers and lakes that led deep into what is now the U.S. Midwest. Without control of this waterway, France would have no way to access the interior, no way to trade with indigenous nations, and no way to move soldiers quickly between its forts and settlements. This river wasn't just important, it was everything. Once inside the continent, the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River expanded France's reach exponentially. The French used these vast waterways not only for trade, but to lay claim to entire regions stretching from modern-day Ontario and Quebec all the way down to New Orleans. This gave them the ability to flank British colonies, box them in, and control east-west expansion. It's easy to forget today, but back then, water was power. Whoever controlled the rivers controlled commerce, communication, and conflict. That's why France built a vast system of forts, from Louisbourg in the east to Fort Detroit, Fort Niagara, and Fort Frontenac in the west. These weren't random outposts. They were strategically placed at choke points, narrow places in the geography, where trade routes funneled and armies could be blocked or ambushed. Controlling these areas meant controlling who could move through them, whether they were fur traders or enemy soldiers. The fur trade itself was more than an economic venture. It was the beating heart of the colony. European demand for beaver pelts was enormous, and furs became the currency of empire. But to maintain the trade, the French needed more than rivers. They needed relationships. They depended on alliances with powerful indigenous nations, like the Huron-Wendat and Algonquin, who not only knew the land but controlled key trapping territories. These alliances weren't just convenient, they were critical. Without them, France would have lost its grip on the interior in a matter of years. So when France sent soldiers, settlers, and supplies across the Atlantic, they weren't doing it for abstract pride. They were investing in a continental stronghold, vast, interconnected zone of influence that could generate wealth, block British advancement, and secure France's place in the global hierarchy of empires. And that's why, in the minds of French kings and generals, Canada wasn't just another colony. It was the centerpiece of New France, the launching pad for control over North America, and the terrain over which the future of the continent would be decided. Losing it would be like losing a queen in a chess match. It would change everything. To understand why France was so committed to defending Canada, you have to follow the money. And in the 17th and 18th centuries, the real gold of North America was fur, especially beaver pelts. In Europe, beaver fur was used to make fashionable felt hats that were durable, water-resistant, and highly coveted among the elite. The demand was insatiable, and it turned the Canadian wilderness into the backbone of a booming transatlantic industry, the fur trade empire. This economy didn't rely on traditional colonization, where settlers farmed land and extracted resources directly. Instead, it was built on mobility, relationships, and networks. At the heart of this system were the voyageurs, French-Canadian men licensed to transport furs over vast distances in massive birch-bark canoes. These were the workhorses of the trade, paddling for weeks or months through dangerous terrain, linking remote Indigenous communities with central trading hubs like Montreal and Quebec. Even more independent were the coureurs de bois, literally, runners of the woods. These were often unlicensed fur traders who ventured deep into Indigenous territory, sometimes adopting Indigenous ways of life, forming partnerships, and even families. They acted as cultural intermediaries, navigating both the European and Indigenous worlds with skill and adaptability. Their success depended on trust and cooperation with Indigenous nations, who were not just suppliers of fur, but powerful players with their own trade routes, diplomacy, and interests. This entire economic system was impossible without Indigenous alliances. The French did not, and could not, hunt all the fur themselves. Indigenous communities, who had lived in harmony with the land for millennia, trapped the animals, prepared the pelts, and brought them to trading posts in exchange for European goods like iron tools, firearms, blankets, and beads. These exchanges were not just economic, they were social and political events, reinforcing alliances, creating obligations, and maintaining peace in many regions. Key cities like Quebec and Montreal became commercial nerve centers. Quebec, founded by Samuel de Champlain in 1608, served as the gateway to the interior, a fortified capital where goods were stored and ships departed for France. Montreal, further upriver, emerged as the vital junction point where the fur routes converged. During spring and summer, these towns would bustle with traders, Indigenous diplomats, French officials, and merchants, all engaged in the business that made New France run. This fur-based economy was incredibly profitable, not just for France, but for the networks of Indigenous nations who leveraged their central position in the trade. However, it also had long-term consequences. Overtrapping, dependency on European goods, and growing rivalries between nations fueled tensions that would later erupt into conflict, especially as the British pushed northward. So when we talk about the economic value of Canada to France, we're not just talking about a few trappers in the woods. We're talking about a continental supply chain, a deeply interwoven system of trade, diplomacy, and culture that stretched from Paris to the Great Lakes. Canada wasn't just some frozen wilderness. It was the beating heart of a global fur empire. For France, colonizing Canada wasn't just about land and wealth. It was also a deeply cultural and spiritual mission. French leaders and the Catholic Church saw New France as a blank slate where they could build not only an economic empire, but a moral and religious one, rooted in the values of Catholicism and French civilization. At the heart of this mission were the Catholic missionaries, particularly the Jesuits. These were highly educated, deeply devoted men who believed it was their sacred duty to bring Christianity to Indigenous peoples. They traveled vast distances, lived in remote villages, and often learned local languages and customs in order to preach the gospel. Their work wasn't just spiritual, it was political. Converting Indigenous communities was seen as a way to integrate them into the French colonial system and reinforce alliances. But religion wasn't the only aspect of France's cultural agenda. France envisioned Canada as an extension of itself, a new France, where French language, laws, and traditions would take root. That's why they encouraged settlers, known as habitants, to farm the land and raise families. These settlers brought with them more than tools and seeds. They brought a way of life, with Catholic churches at the center of their communities, French civil codes governing behavior, and a strong emphasis on family and community. Over time, this led to a blending of cultures, especially through intermarriage. French traders and coureurs de bois often married indigenous women, forming familial and diplomatic ties that benefited both sides. These relationships helped solidify trade routes, political alliances, and cultural understanding. In some cases, entire communities emerged from these unions, most notably the Métis, who carried both French and Indigenous heritage and played a key role in shaping Canadian history. But the cultural mission was not without tension. While many Indigenous people adopted aspects of Catholicism or engaged in trade with the French, they also held firm to their own spiritual beliefs, governance systems, and identities. The Jesuits often documented these beliefs in journals, sometimes with fascination, other times with condemnation. Conversion was never total, and Indigenous nations engaged with missionaries on their own terms, accepting some teachings while rejecting others. France's cultural and religious mission in Canada was far more than a side project of colonization. That was a deliberate and multifaceted strategy that blended spiritual conviction with imperial ambition. To the French, spreading Catholicism and French values wasn't just a byproduct of expansion, it was central to their vision of empire. They believed they were not only claiming land but also civilizing it, reshaping it in their own image, with their language, religion, and customs as the foundation. This belief fueled the efforts of Catholic missionaries, especially the Jesuits, who ventured into remote and often dangerous territories, not simply to preach but to immerse themselves in Indigenous life. They studied local languages, participated in village rituals, and wrote detailed ethnographic accounts that still offer invaluable insight into pre-colonial cultures. Their goal was salvation, saving souls through baptism and conversion, but it was also strategic. Converts became allies, and Catholic communities became anchors of French influence deep within Indigenous territory. Meanwhile, France encouraged the settlement of habitants, French farming families who were meant to transplant French rural life to the New World. These settlers established villages modeled on the seigneurial system, where land was divided and worked collectively under the oversight of a local seigneur. At the heart of each settlement was the Catholic Church, not only a place of worship, but a center of education, social order, and governance. Priests held immense influence, guiding both spiritual and daily life, reinforcing loyalty to the crown and the church. Crucially, this cultural mission also involved interpersonal diplomacy, especially through intermarriage. French fur traders and coureurs de bois frequently married Indigenous women, creating strong kinship ties. These unions were not simply personal, they were political and economic alliances. Through them, trade routes were secured, trust was built, and knowledge was exchanged. Many of these mixed families laid the foundation for Métis communities, who became key intermediaries between French and Indigenous societies, blending languages, customs, and worldviews. Yet, the mission was not universally accepted or peaceful. While some Indigenous groups welcomed aspects of Catholicism or saw strategic value in alliances with the French, others resisted spiritual conversion or the intrusion of European norms. To many Indigenous peoples, the land was sacred, life was communal, and identity was rooted in oral tradition, not hierarchical church structures or rigid doctrines. Despite the missionaries' dedication, conversion was often partial, negotiated, or symbolic. Still, the legacy of France's cultural and religious mission endures, especially in Quebec. The province has maintained a strong Francophone identity, with the French language protected by law and deeply embedded in public life. Catholicism, while less dominant today, shaped centuries of Quebecois education, politics, and values. The influence of France's early colonial project is evident in everything from architecture and cuisine to social customs and legal traditions. So while the mission was driven by a genuine belief in spiritual salvation, it also served to anchor France's claim to territory, build loyalty among settlers, and deepen connections with indigenous nations, on French terms. It was an attempt to transform the wilderness into a mirror of France itself. That transformation was only partially realized, but its cultural imprint remains an integral part of Canada's story. The French and Indian War, 1754-1763, which was the North American theater of the broader Seven Years' War, marked the final chapter of France's colonial ambitions in Canada. Although it was a war fought far from France's shores, it had profound implications for the future of North America. For the French, this was not just a struggle for territory. It was a battle for the survival of their empire and their way of life in the New World. They fought fiercely, not just out of military necessity, but also from deep cultural and political conviction. The stakes, the heart of the French Empire in North America. By the mid-18th century, New France, which encompassed parts of Canada, the Great Lakes region, and the Mississippi Valley, was one of the largest and most resource-rich colonies in the world. However, despite its vast expanse, France's colonial presence was fragile. The British were expanding their own colonies along the eastern seaboard, growing rapidly in both population and wealth. The French understood that control of the fur, trade, key waterways, and access to vital resources were all at risk. If they lost the war, Britain would dominate North America, effectively sidelining French influence in the continent forever. Despite being outnumbered, with only about 60,000 settlers in Canada compared to the 1.5 million British colonists along the eastern seaboard, the French had several advantages. They were battle-tested, having fought for decades in the fur trade, often navigating harsh wilderness and engaging in guerrilla-style tactics alongside their indigenous allies. This gave them a deep understanding of the terrain and the ability to move quickly in the wilderness, often using their alliance with indigenous peoples to bolster their military forces. Key battles: Louisbourg, Quebec, and Montreal. The battle. For Louisbourg, 1758. The siege of Louisbourg was one of the first major confrontations of the war. Louisbourg was a fortress on Cape Breton Island, guarding the entrance to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It was one of the most strategically important French strongholds in North America, controlling access to the St. Lawrence River and the interior of the continent. The British aimed to neutralize it to prevent French reinforcements and supplies from reaching Quebec. The French defended it fiercely, knowing that its fall would pave the way for British advances into the heart of New France. Despite a valiant defense, the French were eventually forced to surrender Louisbourg after a protracted siege, but they knew the true test would come at Quebec. The Battle of Quebec, 1759. The Battle of Quebec is perhaps the most iconic and decisive confrontation of the war. The British, under General James Wolfe, landed at the Plains of Abraham, just outside the fortified city of Quebec. General Montcalm, the French commander, was tasked with defending the city. The battle was a turning point because it was not just a fight for Quebec, but for the very heart of New France. Both sides fought with determination and desperation. The French were well aware of the stakes. If Quebec fell, it would be the end of French control over Canada. The French fought with everything they had, but they were at a disadvantage. The British forces, though also heavily outnumbered, had superior naval power and artillery, which allowed them to cut off French supplies and reinforcements. The battle was brutal, and both Montcalm and Wolfe were killed, but in the end, the British emerged victorious. Quebec's fall essentially sealed the fate of French Canada. It was no longer just about defending the territory. It was about survival. The fall of Montreal, 1760. The final blow came in 1760, when British forces under General Geoffrey Amherst advanced towards Montreal, the last major French stronghold in Canada. After a series of smaller engagements and with Quebec already lost, French resistance was broken. The French commander in Montreal, Pierre de Vaudreuil, recognizing the hopelessness of continuing the fight, surrendered the city. With Montreal's fall, France's hopes for maintaining a foothold in North America were dashed. Why did the French fight so fiercely? The French commitment to the war was not simply because of political or economic interests. It was deeply tied to their identity and vision for the future of New France. France's entire colonial strategy was based on establishing a sustainable and profitable empire in the New World. For the French crown and the people of New France, losing Canada meant losing the heart of their American empire, and with it, the prestige of being a major global power. Furthermore, the French population in Canada had a unique relationship with their territory. Many settlers had come to the New World for opportunities, but there was also a sense of loyalty to their homeland and a deep belief in the importance of the French mission in the Americas. For many, the loss of New France would have been seen, not just as a military defeat but as a humiliation, an acknowledgement that the dream of a French empire in the Americas was dead. Additionally, Indigenous allies played a crucial role in this resistance. Throughout the war, France had formed alliances with several Indigenous nations, including the Huron, Algonquin, and Abenaki. These alliances were based on mutual trade relationships and long-standing diplomacy. For many Indigenous nations, the French presence in Canada was a source of stability and protection against British expansion, which threatened their traditional lands and ways of life. Thus, these alliances were also a reason for the fierce French resistance. Fighting was not just about defending French interests, but also about protecting Indigenous autonomy and alliances, the cost of defeat and the legacy of the war despite their efforts. The French were ultimately defeated, and the Treaty of Paris, 1763, formally ceded most of New France to Britain. The legacy of the French and Indian War, however, remains profound. The battle for Canada marked the end of French colonial ambitions in North America, but also laid the groundwork for the future of Canada itself. The defeat did not erase the French identity. It remained deeply embedded in the cultural and political landscape of Quebec and much of French-speaking Canada today. Indeed, the French fight during the French and Indian War was deeply tied to their vision of a future for New France, a future that was intricately linked not only to territorial control but also to the survival of a unique cultural identity. For the French, Canada was more than just a colony. It was the embodiment of their aspirations for a new world order. The people of New France, settlers, soldiers, missionaries, and traders alike, had poured their lives into this land, building a society based on French values, Catholic faith, and close alliances with Indigenous peoples. A vision for the future. The French envisioned a flourishing society in North America that could rival those of Europe. Unlike the British approach, which often involved large-scale settlement and agricultural development, the French saw their North American empire as a more commercial, cooperative endeavor. The fur trade was at its core, and this trade, along with the careful partnerships with Indigenous nations, was meant to provide the foundation for a stable, sustainable empire. The land was not simply a resource to be exploited. It was a place for mutual coexistence and collaboration, rooted in respect for the land and its peoples. Cultural heritage French culture in Canada was not just a set of traditions or customs, it was a living, breathing force that defined the very essence of the colony. The French language, Catholicism, and French customs were foundational to the social fabric of New France. The French fought to preserve this heritage against the encroaching forces of the British, whose expansion threatened to erase everything that had been built in the New World. The defense of culture, in this sense, was as important as any military maneuver. It was about keeping alive a way of life that had been crafted in the wilderness of North America. The alliance with Indigenous peoples. Perhaps one of the most significant elements of French resistance was their alliance with Indigenous peoples. For the French, the Indigenous nations were not just allies in battle, but partners in the survival of New France. These alliances were not just based on trade. They were based on shared experiences, mutual respect, and the understanding that the survival of one depended on the well-being of the other. In return for their military support, the French provided protection, trade opportunities, and access to European goods that were essential to many Indigenous groups. The French commitment to these alliances wasn't merely strategic. It was personal. Many French settlers, including fur traders and missionaries, formed deep, lasting relationships with Indigenous communities. Intermarriage between the French and Indigenous peoples led to the formation of Métis communities, who became key intermediaries between the two worlds. This partnership was something the French valued deeply. It was not just a tactical advantage, but a shared vision of a multicultural society where both Indigenous and French cultures could thrive. Fierce resistance. Despite overwhelming odds, the willingness of the French to fight against overwhelming odds, against the numerically superior British forces, against the vast distances and harsh conditions of the North American wilderness, was a reflection of their deep attachment to New France. It was not simply a matter of military strategy, it was an emotional and cultural commitment to a vision of North America that they believed in. The French fought because they believed in the cause, because they saw New France as a part of the broader French Empire, and because they wanted to ensure the survival of their way of life, one rooted in alliances, trade, and shared cultural values with indigenous nations. In the end, although France's defeat marked the end of their hopes for empire in North America, the cultural and political legacy of New France lived on, especially in Quebec, where the French language, Catholic, heritage, and multicultural roots have endured for centuries. The fierce resistance of the French during the French and Indian War was not just about defending land, it was about defending a vision for the future, one that was shaped by their unique relationship with the land, its people, and the indigenous nations they fought beside. This deep commitment to both territorial and cultural survival, and their alliances with indigenous peoples, underscores why the French fought so fiercely and why their legacy continues to shape Canada today. The fall of New France in 1763, formalized by the Treaty of Paris, was a defining moment in North American history. After years of brutal conflict, during the 7 Years' War, France ceded most of its North American territories to Britain, including Canada. This was more than just a change of flags. It was the end of a grand vision and the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter for those who had lived under French rule. For the French colonists, farmers, merchants, clergy, and indigenous allies, the loss was deeply personal. Their homeland, which they had cultivated for generations, was now in the hands of a foreign power. Many feared that British control would erase their culture, religion, and legal traditions. And yet, what followed was not cultural extinction, but remarkable cultural survival. In Quebec especially, French identity remained strong. Despite being outnumbered and politically marginalized, French Canadians preserved their language, upheld their Catholic faith, and maintained key aspects of their civil law system. British authorities, recognizing the challenge of governing a fiercely proud French-speaking population, passed the Quebec Act in 1774. This landmark piece of legislation allowed for the continuation of French civil law and granted religious freedom to Catholics, something unthinkable in much of the British Empire at the time. This act didn't just ease tensions, it ensured the endurance of French culture in North America, and that legacy can still be felt today. Quebec remains a French-speaking province with a unique identity, legal system, and cultural pride that sets it apart within Canada. Street signs in French, the preservation of Catholic heritage, and passionate debates about language rights and cultural autonomy all trace their roots back to the fall of New France. Beyond Quebec, French influence also lingers in place names, culinary traditions, and bilingualism as a national policy. The fall of New France didn't erase French Canada. It refined it, forged it in resistance, and shaped a dual cultural identity that continues to define the Canadian experience. Even in defeat, the spirit of New France endured, influencing everything from Canadian law to its multicultural ideals. In many ways, the legacy of New France is a testament to cultural resilience. It reminds us that empires may rise and fall, but identities, when rooted deeply in community, language, and belief, can withstand even the greatest of political upheavals. Canada was far more than a cold outpost on the edge of empire. It was a linchpin of strategy, a goldmine of economic opportunity, and a beacon of cultural identity. For France, holding Canada meant controlling vast trade networks, securing military dominance over North America, and spreading a distinctly French vision of civilization across the Atlantic. The fur trade fueled Europe's demand for luxury, while alliances with indigenous nations offered both protection and partnership in navigating a new world. And beyond the commerce and conquest, there was a deep desire to build something lasting, a new France rooted in language, faith, and culture. The British may have won the war, but the story didn't end there. The essence of New France, its values, its traditions, its people, didn't vanish with the Treaty of Paris. It adapted, survived, and embedded itself into the DNA of modern Canada. From Quebec's strong French identity to Canada's official, Bilingualism, the echoes of that struggle are still felt today. So here's the question. What if France had won the war? Would Canada today be a French-speaking nation from coast to coast? Would its alliances with Indigenous nations have followed a different path? Would the culture, the politics, the very soul of the country look entirely different? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you want more untold stories like this, hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell. In the next episode, we uncover the secret deals and political chess moves behind the Confederation of 1867 and the powerful interests that shaped Canada's future. Stay tuned.